Welcome to High Scary Stories. Tonight we step deep into the wilderness where forgotten trails wind through ancient forests and silence hides things not meant to be seen. From footprints that vanish in the snow to voices that whisper in abandoned cabins, these are not just stories, they are warnings. So turn off the lights, lock your doors, and listen closely. Because out there in the woods, something is always watching. This is High Scary Stories. Let's begin. Story 1. The Thing That Made the Dog Bolt. I grew up in a quiet logging town in southern Oregon, the kind of place where kids still played in the woods until sunset, and everyone knew the name of your dog. Mine was a hound mix named Buddy, a 100-pound lump of muscle and bark who chased off bears more than once. That spring, I was 16 and itching for adventure. My cousin Leo had come to stay with us for a few weeks, and we decided to spend a Friday night camping near the old mining trail a few miles beyond our backyard. It was a forgotten stretch of forest, thick with pine and silence, where an abandoned mine shaft sat sunken in the moss like a scar. My dad used to say nobody should be near that place after dark, but of course we went anyway. We had flashlights, sandwiches, a .22 rifle for coyotes, and of course, Buddy. We thought we were ready for anything. We weren't. The hike in had been quiet. No bird song, no wind, just the steady crunch of our boots over dead pine needles. The deeper we went, the west, the more the trees closed in tall and sharp, like rows of watching figures. Buddy trotted ahead of us, tail up, sniffing the air now and then, but mostly unfazed. We reached the clearing around dusk. It was a patch of flat earth where the collapsed entrance to the old mining shaft lay half buried beneath a slope of rocks and damp ferns. Leo tossed down his backpack and lit a small campfire while I walked to the edge of the shaft, peering into the dark. All I could see was blackness. We joked about ghosts and miners with pickaxes for hands, but neither of us laughed too hard. There was something about that place that felt wrong. Not dangerous, exactly, just off. Like we'd stepped into a part of the woods that wasn't ours. Around 10 o'clock, we were sitting by the fire, passing a can of warm beans back and forth, when Buddy suddenly froze. No bark, no growl. Just silence. He was staring off toward the tree line, eyes locked, ears perked and body stiff. I followed his gaze but saw nothing. That's when we heard it. A soft clicking sound, rhythmic, coming from the shadows beyond the trees. Not footsteps, not branches. Just click, click, click. Buddy let out a low whine and then, without warning, bolted. He didn't look back. He didn't even bark. He just ran crashing through the underbrush like something was chasing him. I'd never seen him run like that before. And in that moment, I felt something ancient and instinctive settle in my gut. Whatever was out there, it wasn't something we could fight. Leo stood up fast, almost knocking over the fire pit, and grabbed the flashlight. I fumbled for mine hands, suddenly clumsy heart pounding so loud, it drowned out the clicking. We called out for Buddy, but the sound vanished into the trees, swallowed whole by the forest. Then it returned, the clicking closer this time, almost at the edge of the firelight. We both turned our flashlights in that direction. The beams flickered weakly, as if the batteries were dying, though they were fresh that morning. The trees stood still, unmoving. No wind, no leaves rustling. Just the clicking sound, now joined by a soft breathing noise. It wasn't animal. It wasn't human either. It was wet, like someone gasping through water. Leo whispered something I couldn't make out, and I realized I was holding my breath. We took a step back and the fire hissed, as if something invisible passed through it. The flames dimmed, then sputtered back to life. That was when we saw it. Just for a second. A tall shape between two trees far too thin, with arms, two long fingers dangling just above the forest floor. Its head was tilted sideways, and I swear it had no eyes. Just folds of pale skin and a mouth that moved slightly soundlessly. We froze. Neither of us could speak. The shape didn't move. It just stood there like it was deciding what to do. Then it raised one hand slowly and pointed. Not at us. Behind us. We spun around and saw nothing. But when we turned back, the figure was gone. Not walked away. Gone. Vanished. Leo dropped the flashlight, and I didn't even notice. Something in my chest screamed that we had to leave. I grabbed his arm and we ran, not toward the trail, but anywhere away from that clearing. I could feel something following. No footsteps, just presence. And it felt old. Older than the mine. Older than the trees. As if the forest itself had woken up. We didn't stop running until the woods thinned and the stars opened above us like cold eyes in the sky. My lungs burned, and Leo stumbled, grabbing at a tree for balance. We had no idea where we were, no trail, no flashlight. Just the dark breathing around us and the memory of what we saw. I wanted to call out for Buddy, but my voice was gone raw with fear and running. After a while, we saw a faint light flickering between the trees. A porch lamp. Civilization. We ran straight toward it, crashing through branches, until we stumbled into someone's backyard and collapsed on the grass. The old man who lived there didn't ask many questions. He gave us water, a flashlight, and pointed us toward the road. Buddy was waiting by our driveway. When we got back, he tail wagging, tongue out, like nothing had happened. But he wouldn't come inside. Not that night. He slept under the porch watching the tree line. The next morning, I went back alone, just to see. The clearing was still there. The fire pit was cold, untouched. But the shaft, what used to be a mound of earth and rocks, was now wide open. Clean. Cleared. Like someone had been digging from the inside. I didn't tell Leo. I didn't tell anyone. A week later, Buddy vanished. No signs of struggle. No tracks. Just gone. And some nights when the wind's quiet and the woods go still, I hear that same soft clicking beyond the trees. Not footsteps, not branching. Just click, click, click. And I remember what I saw. What it pointed at. Not us. Behind us. Like it knew something else was coming. Story 2. The Eyes in the Thicket. 2 years ago, my sister and I joined a small eco-tour in the southern jungle of Mexico, deep inside the Siancan biosphere. It was the kind of untouched wilderness you only see in documentaries, thick with mangroves, towering ceiba trees, and the constant hum of unseen creatures. We weren't thrill seekers, just two university students hoping for a quiet break before finals. The guide was a soft-spoken man named Thomas, who carried an old rifle slung over his shoulder, though he never explained why. On the second night after dinner by the river, Thomas offered to take a few of us on a short evening walk. Just a quick look at the jungle under moonlight, he said. My sister hesitated, but I insisted. There were 5 of us total. No phones, no lights. Just Thomas and his old lantern. The jungle looked different at night, like it had secrets it didn't share during the day. At first, the walk was quiet, almost peaceful. The moon filtered through the canopy in broken silver lines, and the air smelled of wet earth and something sweet we couldn't place. Thomas led us down a narrow path, his lantern casting long shadows that danced across the underbrush. Occasionally, he would stop and point out a plant or bird call, but even his voice seemed softer than usual, as if he didn't want to disturb the dark. My sister clung to my arm. I told her to relax, but truthfully I felt it too, that crawling sensation, like we were being watched. About 20 minutes in, we passed a thicket of low-hanging vines, and something shifted behind them. Just a flicker, a glint, Tomas stopped walking. He didn't move, didn't breathe. Then slowly he raised his hand, motioned for silence. We stood frozen, and the jungle seemed to hush with us. That was when I saw them two pale yellow eyes, low to the ground, gleaming faintly between the leaves. Not glowing, reflecting, like a cat's. But they were too far apart, too steady. My sister whispered that maybe it was a jaguar, but Thomas shook his head. His free hand reached for the rifle, though he didn't lift it. The eyes blinked slowly, then began to rise. Not in a leap, not like an animal rearing up. They rose vertically, smoothly, until they were at least 6 feet off the ground. Then came the sound, a low growl, not from the throat, but deep from the chest, like something warning us not to move. Tomas took a step back, still not raising the rifle, and whispered that we needed to move. Slowly. No running, no loud noises. He turned the lantern slightly, and the light caught more of the figure behind the thicket. It wasn't a jaguar. The outline was all wrong. The body was narrow, too tall, and its arms hung unnaturally low, longer than any animal I'd ever seen. The eyes didn't leave us. They just swayed slightly, like whatever owned them was shifting its weight, preparing for something. The growl deepened, and the others began to panic. One of the tourists, a man from Canada named Evan, started backing away faster than Tomas had warned. He tripped on a root, crashed onto his back, and the growl stopped. For a second, everything went silent again. Then the vines exploded. That thing burst through the thicket, not on 4 legs, but too tall and lean with skin that caught the light like wet stone. It didn't make a sound when it moved. No footsteps, no breath, just a blur of motion that rushed past Thomas and straight towards Evan. My sister screamed. Thomas fired. The shot cracked the silence and echoed through the jungle. The thing vanished into the brush, but not before we all saw it clearly. Its face wasn't right. The mouth stretched too wide, as if it had been cut open at the corners, and there were no visible nostrils, no ears, just a smooth skull and those burning yellow eyes. Evan scrambled up and ran without waiting. We all followed, crashing through undergrowth, ignoring Tomas's pleas to stay together. Branches whipped our faces. Insects stung our arms. Somewhere behind us, that growl returned angrier now. Not hunting, warning. We didn't stop running until we reached the edge of camp in the safety of firelight. Even then, I felt those eyes watching from the dark just beyond the trees. Back at camp, everyone was wide-eyed and shaking. Tomas paced in silence, checking his rifle, muttering to himself in Spanish. My sister sat close to the fire, clutching her knees, too stunned to speak. Evan wouldn't stop apologizing for running. No one blamed him. None of us could explain what we'd seen. Tomas finally sat down and looked at us like he was about to tell a story he'd kept buried for years. He said that sometimes deep in the jungle things appear that are not from our world. Things that mimic predators, but are not animals. Not spirits either. He called them imitadores shadows, that learn how to move like jaguars, how to breathe like panthers, but there's something else entirely, something older. They don't always attack, he said. Sometimes they just watch, measure, decide. He warned us not to speak of it near the jungle again. That night, no one slept. Even the howler monkeys stayed silent, as if the entire forest had gone still. We left the next morning. As the boat pulled away from the shore, I looked back one last time. On the far edge of the trees, just where the shadows began, 2 pale yellow eyes blinked once and disappeared. A week later, my sister developed a fever that lasted 3 days. No infection, no diagnosis. And during those nights, she spoke in her sleep in a language none of us recognized. She never remembered the dreams. But sometimes when she's quiet and alone, she swears she hears that same growl in the back of her mind, low and slow, like it's still deciding whether or not to follow. Story 3. He followed us to another trail. It started on a trail near an old mining ghost town in Colorado. The kind of place that looks frozen in time, with rusted signs, crumbling buildings, and pine trees that seem to whisper when the wind picks up. My friend Marcus and I were hiking there late last fall, hoping to catch the last of the golden leaves before winter set in. We weren't new to hiking, but this place felt different, heavier, like the trees had seen things they didn't want to share. That first afternoon, everything felt normal. Cold air, crunch of leaves, a quiet trailhead with barely a soul around. We set up camp by a dried creek bed just before sunset, cooked noodles over a camp stove, and laughed about how remote it felt. We didn't know yet that someone else was out there. Or something. Watching, waiting. And it wasn't tied to just one trail. That night the cold settled fast. We crawled into our tents early, zipped tight against the chill. Around midnight, I woke up needing to pee. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent, and stepped outside into the silence. The air was dead still, no crickets, no breeze, just a deep quiet that made the forest feel wrong. As I turned to walk toward the tree line, my light caught something on the trail about 20 feet away. A figure, standing perfectly still, tall, maybe 6.5 feet, wearing what looked like faded yellow overalls and some kind of mask or face paint. I froze. The figure didn't move. I blinked, thinking maybe it was a trail sign or a trick of the light. But when I lifted the flashlight again, it was gone. Just trees and fog. Didn't tell Marcus the next morning. I figured I'd imagined it. We packed up and hiked out without another word. A week later, back home, we decided to try a different trail in a state park almost 50 miles away. We took the same gear, same pace, same chill air. It felt good to be out again, to forget whatever weirdness had happened. But halfway through the hike, I felt it again, that static in the back of my neck, that crawling sensation along my spine. Marcus suddenly stopped and whispered, "Do you hear that?" At first I didn't. Then came a sound I'll never forget. Laughter. Not the kind that makes you smile. It was high and broken, like someone pretending to laugh. It echoed just once and then vanished into the trees. We both stood there frozen, staring into the brush where the sound had come from. I scanned the woods, heart pounding, but saw nothing. Marcus whispered again, asking if it was a person, but something in me knew it wasn't. The laughter hadn't come from a voice. It was too hollow, too far off and close at the same time. We moved fast, hiking harder than we needed to, cutting our brakes, short eyes, constantly checking the tree line. We didn't speak much after that, just listened. About 2 miles from the trailhead, we passed an old wooden fence with a sign half rotted away, and that's when Marcus stopped dead. I followed his gaze. Across the fence, maybe 30 yards into the woods, was the same figure I'd seen on the ghost town trail. Same yellow overalls, same pale, motionless posture. But now I could see more. Its face wasn't paint. It was too smooth, too white, like old porcelain left in the sun. And the eyes were too dark. No shine, no light. Just deep black sockets that seemed to absorb everything around them. It didn't move, didn't blink, just stared. I felt sick. We backed away slowly, keeping our eyes on it, then turned and kept walking, trying not to run. That's when we heard it again, the laughter. But this time it was closer. Not in front, behind. We spun around and there was nothing. Just trees. Stillness. We didn't stop until we reached the parking lot. There were other people there, and for a moment it felt like the spell had broken. maybe it was over. But as we packed up the car, Marcus paused, then pointed. Across the road past the wooden sign, standing just behind a pine tree, was the figure. Same clothes, same face, still watching, still smiling. And then it stepped backward, slowly disappearing into the forest. Like it wanted us to know it could follow us anywhere. We drove in silence for a long time, the road winding through hills and evergreens, neither of us willing to say what we'd seen. When we finally got back to town, Marcus asked to crash at my place. Neither of us wanted to be alone. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about how it didn't chase us. It didn't run or scream. It just watched, patient, like it had all the time in the world. The next morning, I woke to Marcus standing in my kitchen, pale and shaking. He said he'd had a dream. In it, he was hiking alone on a trail that never ended, and behind every bend the figure was waiting. Sometimes standing in the open, sometimes crouched behind trees, but always there. Then he said something that chilled me to the bone. In the dream, the thing spoke. Not with words, but with thoughts. And it said, "I followed you because you saw me. I followed you because now I can." That same afternoon, I decided to dig a little. I searched through old forums about Colorado ghost towns and strange sightings. Eventually, I found a thread on an obscure hiking site posted years ago. It mentioned a tall man in yellow overalls seen near an abandoned trail, always smiling, always silent. The last line said, "If you see him once, don't look again. He only needs your attention to find you. I haven't gone hiking since." And Marcus moved away last spring. But last week I found a photo on my doorstep. No note, just a picture of a forest. And in the background, barely visible between two trees, was that same porcelain face, still smiling. Story 4. I dared to say the name in the woods. 3 summers ago, I went camping in the Tennessee hills with 2 friends from college, Jake and Micah. We picked a spot near a shallow stream surrounded by oak and hickory trees, far enough from the road that we felt like we had the forest to ourselves. It was the kind of place where the air feels thick with history, like something old still breathes beneath the soil. That first night, after a few beers and ghost stories, Micah brought up an old Cherokee legend about a creature that mimics voices to lure people into the woods. Jake laughed it off, said he'd heard of it too. A Wendigo, he called it, though the name didn't feel right for these woods. Then he dared me to say its name 3 times. I hesitated. But eventually, I gave in. And that was the moment everything changed. I said it softly at first, almost like a joke, expecting one of them to jump out and scare me. Nothing happened. We all laughed, shrugged it off, and went back to the fire. But about 20 minutes later, the woods fell silent. No crickets, no breeze. Just this heavy stillness that pressed on our ears like we were underwater. Jake tossed another log on the fire, but even the crackling sounded distant. Then we heard it. A voice. It came from the trees across the stream, faint and familiar. It said my name, just once. But it sounded like my sister. The tone, the way she always stretched the first syllable when she was annoyed. It made no sense. She lived hundreds of miles away. I stood up confused and looked at Jake and Micah. Jake was pale. He said he heard his mom's voice. She'd passed away 2 years earlier. Micah didn't say anything. He just stared at the dark, his jaw clenched tight. Another voice called out. This time it was Micah's brother. But Micah didn't have a brother. At least not one who was alive. He'd drowned in a river when they were kids. Micah grabbed the flashlight and pointed it toward the stream. The beam barely cut through the dark, but we saw something move just beyond the edge. Not walking, floating, just a shape. Pale, thin, with a mouth that didn't quite close. It didn't speak, but we still heard voices. Our voices, repeating things we'd just said by the fire, word for word, out of sync, like a recording played too slowly. Micah stepped toward the stream like he was in a trance. Jake grabbed his arm and hissed for him to stop, but Micah just shook him off. His eyes looked glassy, unfocused, like he was listening to something none of us could hear. The shape across the water stayed still, but the voices kept coming. Not just ours now, others. Soft, layered whispers that seemed to come from the trees, the ground, even the air around us. They said our names, asked questions only we knew the answers to, pleaded for help in familiar tones. It was like the woods were pulling memories out of us, twisting them into bait. Then the thing moved. Not fast, not aggressive. It drifted sideways, just above the surface of the stream like it wasn't touching the ground. The face came into view under the flashlight. No eyes, just empty hollow sockets. And the mouth too wide, stretched in a shape that almost resembled a smile, but not quite. I shouted for Micah to come back. Jake raised the flashlight higher, but the beam flickered, then died. Everything went dark, except for the weak glow of the fire behind us. The voices stopped. For a breath, there was only silence. Then all at once the thing let out a noise so low and deep, it rattled our bones. It wasn't a growl. It was a sound I've never heard before or since, like sorrow and hunger and rage all woven together. Micah turned back toward us then. His nose was bleeding. His shirt was soaked with sweat. He whispered, "It's still using my brother's voice." But that's not him. We didn't wait. We grabbed our packs and ran the fire, forgotten, the gear abandoned. As we sprinted through the dark, the voices returned louder, chasing us through the trees, repeating our own screams back to us. Each time just a little bit off. Just enough to know they weren't really ours. We didn't stop running until we reached the gravel road where the car was parked. The moment our feet hit the open ground, the voices stopped like they had been cut off by an invisible line. We dove into the car, slammed the doors, and locked them without saying a word. Jake started the engine with shaking hands and peeled out so fast he nearly left the road. Nobody spoke on the drive back. The woods behind us faded into black, but I could still feel something watching just beyond the reach of the headlights. Back in town, we stayed at a motel for the night. None of us wanted to go home alone. Micah barely spoke. He just sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. Around 2 a.m, he finally muttered that he had seen something else before we ran. Not the creature, not the thing mimicking his brother. He saw another version of himself standing just behind the figure staring back at him. Same clothes, same face, but its eyes were hollow and its mouth never moved. He said it was smiling too. That night we made a pact, never speak of the name again, never go back to those woods. But 2 weeks ago I got a voicemail from Micah. He sounded distant, slow. He said, "I think it found me again." Then he laughed. Not like him, like the thing in the woods, that same high broken laugh. I called back, no answer. Jake tried too, nothing. Micah's number is still disconnected, but sometimes when I'm alone at night, I hear a voice outside my window. It sounds like him, but not quite. Story 5. Something waited in the pines. The walk back to the cabin was only half a mile through the pines, a straight path I'd taken dozens of times. It was late October, and the forest near northern Michigan was starting to turn cold and still. I had spent the weekend helping my uncle close up the place for winter, clearing out the pantry and draining the pipes. That evening, I decided to visit a neighbor 2 lots down for coffee before heading home. I left just before sunset, thinking I'd beat the dark. No flashlight, no jacket. Just a quiet walk through trees I thought I knew. The sky turned faster than I expected, and within minutes the trail was swallowed by shadow. Still, I wasn't worried. Not yet. The woods were familiar. Safe. Or so I had always believed. The air grew colder with every step, of the kind of cold that clings to your skin, even under layers. But I wasn't layered. Just a long-sleeve shirt and jeans. The pine trees on either side of the trail stood like tall sentinels, unmoving their branches dense enough to block the moonlight. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. No wind. No distant rustle. Not even the usual hoot of an owl or crunch of a squirrel. It was as if the woods were holding their breath. I kept walking slower now, my boots crunching faintly against frost-covered leaves. That was when I noticed it. The smell. Faint but sharp, like old iron or wet pennies. It made my stomach turn. I paused, listening. A sound drifted in from behind me. Barely there. A soft scrape, like something dragging across bark. I turned around, but saw nothing. Just the same line of trees and the narrow path disappearing into dark. I told myself it was a deer or maybe a branch falling. But a few more steps forward, and the noise came again, this time to my left, deeper in the woods. Another scrape followed by a soft thump like a footstep. I stopped. The hairs on my neck lifted. My breath clouded in front of me and drifted slowly upward, but the air around me felt dead still. I waited, hoping it would stop, hoping whatever it was would pass. And then I saw it. Between two trees just beyond the path, something was crouching. Not an animal, not quite a person. Its arms were too long and its head was tilted like it was listening. And then it moved. Just a shift. But enough to know it had seen me too. I stood frozen on the trail, too afraid to breathe. The figure between the trees didn't move again, not at first. It just crouched there, its outline barely visible in the low light, limbs twisted in angles that didn't look right. I blinked hard, thinking maybe I was seeing things, but when I opened my eyes again, it was standing. Not slowly, instantly. Like it had been pulled upright by invisible strings. It was tall, taller than any man I knew, with shoulders that seemed too narrow for its frame. I couldn't see its face, just the silhouette against the darker woods, but I felt its eyes on me. Not curious, not confused, just watching, measuring. I took a step back. It mirrored me, stepping forward from between the pines and onto the edge of the trail. I took another step back. It stepped again, closer. I turned and started walking, heart thudding so loud I could hear it in my ears. My steps quickened. The thing followed, not loudly, just the soft crunch of something walking behind me, perfectly in time with my steps. I stopped. It stopped. I turned my head slightly. Still nothing there, but the feeling didn't leave. It had moved off the trail again, staying just out of sight, stalking the edge, like a predator, keeping pace. Then I heard it breathe. A low rattling inhale that came from the trees to my right. Close, too close. I started running. Branches whipped my arms and face as I tore through the dark, my boots slipping on frost-covered ground. I didn't dare look back. I didn't want to see how close it really was. But I could hear it. No screams, no growls, just breathing, calm and steady, like it wasn't in a hurry, like it knew exactly how far I could run before I would fall. I reached the cabin door with shaking hands, nearly dropping the keys as I fumbled to unlock it. Behind me, the forest stood silent, not a single sound echoing from the trail. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and backed away, waiting to hear something outside, a knock, a scratch, anything. But nothing came. I sat on the floor for what felt like an hour, heart pounding in my throat, every creak of the old wood making me flinch. Eventually, I moved to the window and pulled back the curtain just an inch. The pines swayed gently now, as if nothing had happened, as if the woods had returned to sleep. There was no sign of anything, no footprints, no figure. But something felt wrong inside the cabin, too. The air was thick colder than it had been when I left. And I noticed a faint trail of moisture along the floorboards, leading from the front door to the hallway. I followed it slowly, my breath held. It stopped right outside the bedroom. I opened the door, half expecting to find nothing. But the window was wide open, and on the sill something had been left behind. A single pine cone, slick with moisture, placed upright in the center. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't stay another night after that either. I left the next morning without looking back. Weeks later, I read a local forum post from someone who had hiked near the same woods. They described something watching them, breathing behind them. They ended their post with one sentence that still haunts me. It doesn't need to chase you. It just wants to know where you live. Story 6. We opened the cabin that should have stayed shut. The abandoned ranger cabin sat at the edge of a narrow lake deep in the Rocky Mountains, half buried by time and snow. My cousin Eli and I found it during a backcountry trip last September, a 3-day hike from the nearest trailhead. It wasn't on any of the maps. The roof sagged windows boarded, and the front door was chained shut with a rusted lock that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. We should have left it alone. But something about it pulled us in. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the quiet way the forest seemed to go still when we stood near it. Whatever it was, we decided to come back the next morning with tools to pry it open. We told ourselves it was just a building, just wood and nails. But it felt like more, like the mountain had buried it for a reason. The next morning, the sky was gray and heavy, and the wind had picked up along the ridge. Eli brought a small crowbar, and I carried a multi-tool and a small hammer. The hike back to the cabin felt longer than it had the day before, like the trail itself didn't want us returning. When we arrived, the forest around it was silent. No birds, no insects. Even the trees looked different, like they were leaning slightly inward. We walked up the steps, and Eli wedged the crowbar into the old door frame. The wood cracked loudly, echoing too far for such a small sound. It took longer than expected, but eventually the chain gave way, and the door creaked open. The smell hit us first. Not rot exactly, more like damp paper and something older. The air inside was stale and unmoving. Dust floated through the weak light, slipping through gaps in the boards. The room was small. A desk, 2 chairs, a rusted stove, and in the corner, a child's bed frame, too small for any ranger's quarters. We stepped inside slowly, whispering like we were in a place that didn't want to be disturbed. Eli found an old ledger on the desk. Most of the pages were faded, but one line near the end stood out. Do not feed it. Do not let it speak. That's when we noticed the floorboards near the bed. They weren't nailed down like the rest, just loosely resting in place. Eli reached out to lift one. I grabbed his arm and said maybe we should leave it alone. He looked at me and said, "It's just a cabin." But we both knew that wasn't true. Not anymore. Eli pulled up the first loose board, and a sharp breath of cold air rushed out from the space beneath, like something exhaling after a long sleep. The smell deepened, a damp earth scent mixed with something sweet and wrong, like decaying fruit. We leaned over and shone our flashlight into the gap. Below was a crawl space, maybe 4 feet deep, walled in by stone and dirt. At first, it looked empty. Then we saw the outline of something curled in the corner. Small, pale, almost childlike. Its back was to us, spine arched and limbs folded tightly against its body. At the sound of our breath, it moved barely. A twitch of a shoulder, a slight turn of the head. I stepped back instantly. Eli stayed frozen, flashlight shaking in his hand. Then it turned to face us. Its eyes were the worst part. Not blank or glowing, just deeply sunken like it hadn't blinked in years. The mouth opened, but no sound came out. Just a shape of word maybe forming silently on its lips. I grabbed Eli and yanked him back. The flashlight slipped from his hand, clattered into the crawl space, casting its beam wildly around the walls. We saw marks then, dozens of them. Carvings, handprints, symbols scratched deep into the stone. Some were fresh. Some looked like they had been etched with fingernails. The creature started to crawl toward us, its limbs moving wrong, too smooth, like it wasn't using muscles. I slammed the boards back into place and pushed the desk over the top. Eli was shaking, whispering something over and over. I think it spoke. I think it spoke. We backed out of the cabin and didn't stop running until we were halfway down the mountain. The wind had picked up again, but now it carried a sound behind us. Not words. Not screams, just a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers on wood, like something waiting. Again. We made it back to our main camp just after dark, breathless and rattled, barely able to speak. Eli couldn't stop pacing, mumbling to himself, while I packed our gear in silence. Neither of us slept that night. Every time the wind rustled through the trees, we froze. It wasn't just fear. It was a feeling like we'd opened something that hadn't moved in a very long time. And now it was aware again. By morning, we were on the trail back to the car, moving fast and speaking little. A week later, back home, I started having dreams. Always the same. I'm standing in the doorway of that cabin. The boards are gone, the floor is open, and something is calling me, not with sound, but with memory moments. I'd forgotten voices of people I miss, all pulling me closer. I haven't told Eli. We haven't spoken since the day we got back. But last week I got a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a notebook. The same kind as the ledger we found in the cabin. The last page had a single sentence written in handwriting I didn't recognize. You let it speak. The next morning, I woke to find 3 small pine cones placed on my porch, perfectly aligned. I live nowhere near pine trees. That night, I heard the tapping again. Not from outside, from beneath the floorboards in my bedroom. I haven't slept since. Some places were boarded up for a reason, and some things are never meant to hear their own name. Story 7. Footsteps on the Glacier Road. Last winter, my partner and I traveled to Iceland for New Year's, hoping to escape the noise of the city and see the northern lights. We rented a small camper van and drove deep into the highlands, far from the tourist routes. One night we pulled off onto a remote glacier road, a long stretch of snow-covered gravel cutting through endless white hills. There were no other cars, no towns for miles, just the hum of the heater and the wind tapping against the van walls. We parked beneath a sky full of stars and climbed into our sleeping bags, thinking we'd found peace. Around 3 a.m, something woke me. A noise I couldn't place. Slow, heavy. It came from outside. At first I thought it was just the wind, but then it came again. 3 footsteps. Then silence. I sat up slowly, listening. The van was dark, except for the faint green shimmer of the aurora filtering through the frosted windows. My partner was still asleep, breathing steady, undisturbed. I held my breath, straining to hear through the insulated walls. At first, there was nothing. Then the sound came again, 3 distinct steps, heavy and deliberate, crunching snow beneath them. Then nothing. No retreat, no shift, just silence. I thought maybe it was an animal, but something about the spacing was wrong. Too slow, too measured. I reached for the flashlight and slid quietly toward the front of the van. The windshield was fogged from the inside, so I wiped a small circle clear with my sleeve and peered out. The moon reflected off the white expanse, and everything looked still, empty. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. Something just beyond the edge of where the lights reached. I waited, staring, trying to catch any movement. Then I noticed them. Tracks in the snow, not animal prints, human. Barefoot, 5 long toes, and an arch spaced far apart leading from the center of the road to the side of the van. They stopped directly at the passenger door. I turned slowly and looked toward my partner, heart pounding. They were still sleeping, unaware. I wanted to wake them, but something told me not to move. I looked back through the glass, but the footprints were gone. Erased, like they'd never been there at all. I stared at the snow where the footprints had been just moments before, my breath fogging the windshield again as panic started to creep in. I wiped the glass harder, heart-racing eyes, scanning the white expanse for any sign of movement. Nothing. The wind had picked up slightly, but it wasn't strong enough to erase prints that deep. Not in seconds. I turned the key in the ignition to power the headlights, bathing the Glacier road in a wide cone of pale light. Still nothing. No figures. No animals. No tracks. Just smooth, untouched snow stretching in every direction. Then came a soft knock. Not at the door, at the window behind me. I spun around so fast I nearly knocked the flashlight from my lap. My partner stirred but didn't wake. I waited frozen in place, listening. The knock didn't come again, but a faint outline began to appear in the condensation on the glass. 5 long marks, like fingers dragging slowly down the outside of the window. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The marks stopped halfway down and then vanished as if wiped clean. I turned off the headlights and sat in the dark, straining to hear anything beyond the walls of the van. Then the footsteps returned. 3 slow steps circling toward the back of the van, each one crushing the snow with impossible weight. I couldn't tell how close they were, but I knew they weren't moving away. They were staying just far enough to keep me guessing. I wanted to scream, to shake my partner awake and drive out of there, but I couldn't move. Something about the silence that followed made it worse than the footsteps. Because the silence was patient. It waited. It listened. Like whatever was out there knew I was awake. And it didn't mind waiting until I came out, or until I opened the door. I sat in that van until the sky began to pale, watching the windows like a man waiting for a verdict. At some point, my partner stirred awake and asked why the heater was off. I didn't answer right away. I just told them we needed to leave. Now, they must have seen something in my face, because they didn't argue. We drove for miles without speaking, winding back toward the main road. When we finally hit asphalt again, I felt something lift from my chest, like whatever had been pressing against us in that open space had stayed behind. But it wasn't over. That night back at a guest house in Reykjavik, I stepped out to get something from the car. The lot was quiet, the air still. As I reached the driver's side door, I noticed something in the condensation on the back window. 5 long streaks spaced like fingers. I froze, looked around. No one. No sound. Just the marks. When I returned to the room, I didn't say anything. I couldn't. A week after we got home, I received an email from a stranger. No subject line, just a photo. It was our van parked on the Glacier Road, taken from a distance. From the side, and standing next to it was a figure. Tall, barefoot, blurred, like it wasn't quite part of the world around it. No name, no message. Just one line beneath the image. You left too early. I wasn't finished. Story 8. My Grandfather's Shed. When I was a kid, I spent every summer at my grandfather's farm in the south of Chile, tucked between the foothills and a long stretch of dense forest. It was quiet, almost forgotten by the world, with a red tin-roofed house, a garden out back, and an old wooden tool shed that sat at the far edge of the property. My grandfather never let anyone near that shed. He kept it locked with a thick chain and always said it was unsafe, full of rusted metal and broken tools. I believed him, until the summer he passed. That year, I was 19 and came back to help my grandmother clear the place out. The first thing she told me was simple: stay out of the shed. But this time I didn't listen. The first few days were quiet. I spent them boxing up old books, sorting through drawers, and cleaning the back porch where my grandfather used to sit and smoke his pipe in the evenings. But the shed kept pulling my attention. Every time I looked out the kitchen window, I saw it at the edge of the field, half hidden behind a thicket of trees. The chain was still there, rusted and wrapped tightly around the door handle. One morning I found the key in a small wooden box inside my grandfather's nightstand. It was heavy and cold, with a faded tag that simply read, "Do not use." I told myself I was just curious, that I needed to know what he had been hiding. So that afternoon, I walked across the dry grass, key in hand. The door creaked when I opened it, stiff from years of disuse. Inside, the air was thick and stale, filled with the smell of oil, dirt, and something else I couldn't place. Something sweet and rotting. The walls were lined with shelves, most empty, a few holding dusty jars and old tools. In the center of the floor sat a small wooden crib, perfectly intact, though the paint was peeling. I stepped closer. There were no toys, no blankets, just a faint stain at the bottom of the wood. That was when the light shifted. Not outside, inside, as if the shadows in the corners had drawn in tighter, pressing against me. The temperature dropped. I turned to leave, but the door had swung closed behind me. And then I heard it, a soft breath, right behind my ear. I spun around, heart thudding, but there was no one there. Just the empty shed, the crib, and the thick air pressing against my skin like a damp cloth. I tried the door. It opened easily now, as if it had never been locked at all. I stepped out into the fading sunlight, skin cold despite the warmth of the day, and told myself it had been my imagination. But something had changed. That night, back inside the house, I started hearing sounds from the field. Not animals, not wind, just soft thuds like someone walking barefoot through the grass. I looked out of the window and saw nothing. But the sound stopped every time I turned away, like it wanted me to listen, not see. The following morning, I found the back door wide open. The footprints on the porch were muddy, human-shaped, and far too small to be my own. My grandmother hadn't woken once. When I asked her about the shed, her face went pale. She told me my grandfather had built it himself after their first child died at birth. A girl. The crib had been hers. After that, he refused to let anyone near it. Said it was better she stayed there than come back in another way. I didn't know what that meant until the third night. I woke up around 3 in the morning and saw the door to my bedroom slowly creak open. Standing in the doorway was a figure no taller than a 5-year-old, completely still. I couldn't see her face, but her head tilted the same way my grandfather used to when something displeased him. Then she stepped backward, not walking, but gliding, and disappeared down the hall. I haven't returned to that house since. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear small feet on the floor behind me, and when I turn to look, the air always smells faintly of old wood and sweet decay. After that night, I left before the sun came up. I packed my bags in silence and told my grandmother I had to go back to school early. She didn't question it. She only pressed a small silver cross into my hand and told me to keep it close. I never told her what I saw. I don't think I needed to. On the bus ride back to the city, I kept seeing that hallway in my mind, the way the figure moved, how it didn't touch the ground. For weeks I couldn't sleep with the door closed. I started leaving lights on in every room, and even then, I'd wake to find them off in the morning. Once I found tiny wet footprints in my bathroom. No one else lived with me. I burned the shoes I'd worn to the shed. I tried to forget. But forgetting doesn't mean it goes away. Last month I got a letter in the mail with no return address. Inside was a photograph. It was old, creased at the corners. It showed the shed decades ago, still new, still clean. And standing in front of it was my grandfather, younger, smiling. But next to him was a little girl in a white dress. Her face was turned toward the camera, eyes wide. I had never seen her before, but I recognized the tilt of her head. And scrawled on the back of the photo in handwriting I didn't know were just 5 words. You should have stayed out. Story 9. The Deer That Didn't Bleed. When I was 11, my father took me hunting for the first time in the deep woods, near the Polish border close to Białowieża. It was a quiet place, untouched and endless, filled with thick trees and shadows that always seemed to move just out of sight. We stayed in a small wooden cabin with no electricity, just oil lamps and an old fireplace. My father said the best way to learn the forest was to be part of it, to walk its paths in silence and pay attention to what most people miss. On the second evening, just before sunset, we saw a deer standing completely still near the edge of a clearing. My father raised his rifle, fired once, and the deer dropped without a sound. But when we walked up to it, something didn't feel right. It should have been bleeding. But it wasn't. The deer lay perfectly still, eyes open and glassy, its legs tucked beneath it, like it had just decided to lie down. My father knelt beside it and ran his hand along its flank, frowning. There was no blood, no entry wound. But we had both heard the shot hit. It had dropped immediately. He checked again, parting the fur at the shoulder where he had aimed. Still nothing. No torn flesh, no bruise. Just smooth, undisturbed hide. I asked him if maybe he missed, but he shook his head. I never miss from that range, he said quietly. He stood and told me to help him carry it back to the cabin. We dragged the body across the soft earth, and that's when I noticed the prints it left behind. They weren't deep, not like you'd expect from something that size. More like the deer had been floating just above the ground. I didn't say anything, afraid he'd laugh, or worse, get angry. That night, my father tried to butcher it, but his knife wouldn't cut through the hide, not even a scratch. He changed blades, tried again. Nothing. It was like trying to cut through the stone. Finally, he gave up and muttered something in Polish under his breath that I didn't understand. We left the body on the porch and went inside. I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the deer standing up, walking around the cabin, silent and raw. Just after midnight, I heard the boards creak and something dragging slowly across the porch. I sat up in bed, barely breathing, listening to the slow scrape of hooves against the wooden boards just outside. It wasn't hurried. It wasn't panicked. Whatever was moving out there knew exactly where it was going. I crept to the small window and pulled the curtain back just an inch. The moonlight was bright enough to cast silver across the porch. The deer was standing upright. But it wasn't how a deer should stand. Its front legs were too long now, joints bent backward, as if they had been broken and reset the wrong way. Its head hung low, almost touching the ground, and its neck twitched every few seconds like it was adjusting to a weight it shouldn't be carrying. I stepped back from the window and clamped a hand over my mouth. I didn't want to scream. I didn't want it to know I was watching. My father was asleep in the next room. I wanted to wake him, but something in my chest told me not to. Like I would be pulling him into something that didn't belong to either of us. I stood there frozen for what felt like hours until the porch went quiet. Then came the soft knock, not on the door, but on the side wall low to the floor, like something was feeling along the edge. Tap, tap, then silence. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the sun finally rose, I ran outside half expecting to find nothing at all. But the deer was gone. In its place were tracks. Not deer prints. Footprints. Human. Bare. Leading off into the forest. My father didn't say anything when I told him. He only packed our things and said we were leaving a day early. As we drove away, I looked back one last time. The cabin stood quiet, but something moved in the trees behind it. Something that turned its head and watched us go. We never went back to that cabin. My father sold the land the following spring without a word of explanation, and any time I asked about that trip, he'd change the subject or leave the room. Years passed. I went to college, moved to a city, built a life that felt as far from those woods as possible. But sometimes, just before falling asleep, I still hear that dragging sound. And every winter without fail, I dream of the clearing where we first saw the deer. In the dream, it's always standing in the same place, staring directly at me. Never blinking, never bleeding. A few months ago, I received a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a Polaroid photo. It was the cabin, old and weathered, but still standing. On the porch where we had left the deer's body, there was now a figure crouched, low arms, too long for its frame, its face hidden by a mess of antlers and matted fur. Behind it, carved into the wood of the cabin wall, was a word I hadn't seen since I was a kid. My name. Scratched deep. Not written, but clawed in like someone or something had been waiting a long time to remind me. I burned the photo that night. But the next morning when I looked out my window, there were hoof prints in the frost below, leading right up to my door, then stopping, like it was waiting to be invited in. Story 10. It said to run. 3 summers ago, I worked as a wilderness guide in the Bitterroot Range of Montana, leading small groups on multi-day treks through remote trails. It was quiet work, mostly backpackers looking for solitude or photographers chasing perfect light. One afternoon, I was alone scouting a new path through a narrow stretch of pine forest. No cell signal. No one for miles. Just me, the wind, and the steady crunch of boots on dried needles. About 2 hours in, I found something odd, an old wooden sign nailed high on a tree nearly hidden by moss. The paint was faded, but I could still make out the words. In shaky red letters, it said only one thing: run. I stared at the sign for a long moment, unsure if it was some kind of joke or leftover trail marker. It didn't point in any direction, didn't offer context, just that one word. Run. I took a photo thinking I'd ask the ranger station about it later and continued on. But as I moved deeper into the forest, something began to feel off. The light shifted. The air grew still. Even the birds had gone silent. I chalked it up to altitude or my nerves, but I started glancing over my shoulder more than usual. About a mile in, I found a clearing with a small stream. I bent down to refill my bottle, and that's when I noticed it. A single footprint in the soft earth beside the water. Not a boot, not an animal. Barefoot, large, deep. Too deep for any normal person to make unless they weighed several hundred pounds. The stride was wide too. Whoever it was had stepped across the stream in one movement. I followed the prints with my eyes as they disappeared into the trees on the far side. Something told me not to follow, so I turned back the way I came. But after 10 minutes, I realized I wasn't on the same trail. The path had shifted. Trees looked different. I should have recognized landmarks, but nothing was familiar. Then I saw another sign. Same wood, same faded red paint, nailed to a tree ahead. It said, "Run again?" Only this time the letters were fresh, wet, as if someone had painted them minutes before I arrived. I stepped back instinctively, heart pounding, staring at the wet letters dripping down the bark. There was no sound, not the wind, not birds, not even my own breathing. Just silence, heavy and pressing, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees, half expecting someone to step out and laugh at the prank. But no one came. I wiped my palms on my pants and took a deep breath. I told myself to stay calm. I had my compass. I could backtrack. But when I pulled it out, the needle spun slowly in circles. Useless. I knew then I was being watched. Not the kind of watching you can explain, but the deep, prickling sensation at the base of your skull, as if something is standing just behind you, but never makes a sound. I started walking fast, not quite running. The forest seemed to close in around me, trees crowding tighter, the trail narrowing until there was barely space to pass. Every few hundred feet, another sign appeared. Same word, same dripping red paint. Run. Sometimes they were nailed to trees. Other times they were scratched into bark carved deep and jagged. I don't know how long I moved like that, jogging, ducking under branches, ignoring the pain in my legs, but eventually the trees opened into a small meadow. For a second, I felt relief. Then I saw what was in the center. A tree taller than the rest, burned black from lightning. Hanging from one of its branches was a tattered backpack. My backpack, the one I had left back at base camp that morning. It swayed gently in the breeze, like it had been waiting for me. That was when I heard the first voice. It didn't come from the trees. It came from directly behind me. A whisper. Not in English, not in any language I knew. But I understood it anyway. It said, "Keep running." And then the forest screamed. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The sound that came from the forest wasn't made by anything human. It was high and broken, like wind tearing through shattered glass. I ran across the meadow, lungs burning, vision shaking. Branches whipped at my face, and more signs blurred past me on the trees, each one screaming the same word in blood-red paint. Run. I don't remember how I found the road, only that I burst through the trees and collapsed in the gravel as a truck rounded the bend. The driver swerved, jumped out shouting, and helped me into the cab. I couldn't speak, just pointed behind me. He drove me straight to the ranger station. I tried to explain, but the more I talked, the more their faces closed off. They said there was no burned tree in that area, no meadow, and definitely no signs. I offered to take them there. Show them. But when they checked my GPS data, the route was gone. Wiped. I had never been on the trail at all. A week later, I returned home and unpacked my gear. Inside my bag was a piece of wood I didn't remember placing there. It was a broken piece of tree bark, stained faintly red. Carved into the surface was one word written in the same shaky script I'd seen nailed to the trees. It didn't say run this time. It said soon. I haven't gone into the woods since, but I've started seeing the word again, scratched into the condensation on my bathroom mirror, written in dust on the back window of my car. Always in red, always fresh. Thank you for venturing into the darkness with us. If these stories sent chills down your spine, don't keep the fear to yourself. Leave a comment, smash that like button, and share this video with someone who dares to listen in the dark. We release terrifying true stories every week, so be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's lurking in the shadows. This is High Scare Stories, where nightmares don't end when the video does. Until next time, stay safe and stay scared.